What if I told you that the man who gave workers weekends off was the same man who had a portrait of himself hanging in Hitler's office? This is the story of Henry Ford, and it's nothing like what you think you know. This man changed your life in ways you can't imagine, but the price was darker than anyone realizes. By the end of this video, you'll question everything you thought you knew about progress, innovation, and the cost of genius. Chapter 1. The Lazy Genius. Neighbors called him the laziest boy on earth, but he was secretly conducting experiments that would reshape civilization. Born on July 30, 1863, in Dearborn, Michigan, Henry Ford was everything a farm family didn't want in their eldest son. While his 5 younger siblings worked the fields under the scorching sun, Henry spent his days indoors, avoiding every responsibility that came with being the oldest child. One neighbor didn't mince words, describing Henry as the laziest boy on the face of the earth. But they were all wrong. Henry wasn't lazy, he was obsessed. While other kids played with toys, Henry was sharpening his mother's knitting needles into makeshift screwdrivers, conducting secret experiments with clocks and farming equipment. He was trying to understand something that no one else seemed to care about: how machines actually worked. This wasn't childhood curiosity. This was the beginning of an obsession that would consume his entire life. The moment that changed everything came when Henry turned 13. His father gave him a pocket watch, probably hoping it would teach him responsibility and punctuality. Instead, Henry taught himself to take it apart and put it back together again. Over and over and over. He practiced until he could do it blindfolded, until he could do it faster than anyone had ever seen. Before long, people from neighboring towns were paying him to repair their watches. A 13-year-old boy had accidentally discovered his life's calling. But then came the vision that would haunt him for decades. Traveling to Detroit with his father, Henry saw something that shouldn't have existed: a vehicle moving without horses. It was a steam-powered tractor, chugging along the road like something from a fever dream. While his father saw a curiosity, Henry saw the future. He made a silent promise to himself that day, a promise that would drive him to success and ultimately to madness. He would build a machine like that himself. Tragedy struck that same year. Henry's mother died from childbirth complications, and with her went the only person who truly understood him. He later described life on the farm without her as a watch without a mainspring. The boy who had spent his childhood avoiding farm work now hated it with a burning passion. He felt destined for something greater than milking cows and harvesting crops. But as the eldest son, his father expected him to eventually inherit the farm. This tension would define their relationship for years to come. Chapter 2. 6 Days to Failure. At 16, he abandoned everything for a dream and lost it all in less than a week. The breaking point came when Henry could no longer stand the suffocating life on the farm. Against his father's wishes and despite having no real plan, he packed his few belongings and headed to Detroit. This wasn't just teenage rebellion, this was a desperate escape from a life he knew would kill his soul. His father was devastated. In one moment, Henry had destroyed the family succession plan and shattered their relationship. Detroit was supposed to be Henry's salvation, but reality hit him like a sledgehammer. Within just 6 days of starting his new job, Henry Ford was fired. Suddenly, he found himself alone in a strange city with no income, no prospects, and nowhere to turn. The boy who had promised himself he would build horseless carriages was now just another failed runaway with empty pockets and broken dreams. But help came from the most unexpected source: his father. Despite his disappointment and hurt, Henry's father reached out to an old friend who owned a machine shop in Detroit. He got Henry a job as a repairman not because he approved of Henry's choices, but because he recognized his son's remarkable mechanical ability. It was an act of love disguised as practical assistance. Henry found cheap housing with his aunt and took on additional night work as a jewelry repairman to make ends meet. Between the two jobs, he scraped together $5.50 a week, barely enough to survive. But this period of struggle was actually perfect for Henry's development. As a repairman, he got to work with dozens of different machines, learning their secrets and understanding their principles. This was the education he had never received in school, taught by necessity and hunger rather than textbooks and teachers. After 9 months, Henry felt he had learned everything he could from the machine shop. He made a decision that seemed crazy to everyone around him. He quit his steady job and moved back home to the farm he had fled. His father welcomed him back, but Henry wasn't surrendering to farm life. He was preparing for something bigger. Chapter 3. The Silent Engine Revolution. In a magazine, he found 3 words that would change the world forever. It was 1885 when Henry first read about something called a silent gas engine in a technical magazine. His initial reaction was dismissive. The engine seemed too weak to be useful for anything important, certainly not powerful enough for the horseless carriage he still dreamed of building. He filed the information away and continued his experiments with steam power, but fate had other plans. A few years later, someone brought Henry a broken gas engine to repair. The moment he opened it up and began working on it, everything changed. This engine was producing far more power than he had expected, and it was incredibly lightweight compared to the massive steam engines he was used to. Suddenly, Henry realized he had found the missing piece of his puzzle. This was the heart his horseless carriage had been waiting for. Henry convinced his fiancée Clara that they should move back to Detroit so he could learn more about gasoline engines. She agreed, which was fortunate because Henry had already accepted a job at the Edison Illuminating Company a week earlier. Thomas Edison was one of Henry's heroes, and working for Edison's company felt like joining the pantheon of great inventors. The job also gave him hands-on experience with gasoline engines, exactly what he needed. Henry impressed everyone at Edison Illuminating with his mechanical genius and innovative thinking. He quickly worked his way up to chief engineer, doubling his salary to $80 a week. But the best part of his new position was that it only required him to be on call, giving him plenty of free time to work on his own inventions. He was finally getting paid well to learn exactly what he needed to know, while having time to pursue his real passion. At a company retreat, Henry finally got to meet Thomas Edison himself. When Henry explained his horseless carriage concept, Edison didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, the great inventor encouraged Henry to keep pursuing the idea. They would later become close friends, but that moment of validation from his hero gave Henry the confidence to push forward with renewed determination. Christmas Eve, 1893 became a date Henry would never forget. He burst into his house where Clara was preparing for the holiday and announced that he had finally built his first gasoline engine. It was crude and only ran for about a minute, but it worked. All those years of tinkering, experimenting, and dreaming had finally produced something real. Henry Ford had crossed the threshold from dreamer to inventor. Chapter 4. 3 companies, 2 failures, 1 legend. He failed twice in exactly the same way until he discovered the secret that made him unstoppable. With a working gasoline engine finally in hand, Henry spent the next 3 years obsessively building his first horseless carriage. He scavenged parts from the Edison factory that would have been thrown away, using leftover tubing and discarded materials to construct what he called the quadricycle. It looked exactly like what it was: 2 bicycles welded to a square chassis with an engine mounted on top. On the morning of June 4, 1896, Henry took his quadricycle out for its first test drive. Not only did it work, but it drove quickly and reliably, reaching speeds of up to 20 miles per hour. While other inventors had already created gas-powered automobiles, Henry's machine was among the fastest of its time. More importantly, it proved that his vision was possible. Henry immediately sold the quadricycle for $200 and used every penny to start building a second, improved version. This one took him 3 more years to complete, but when he finished, he had created something truly impressive. A larger, faster, smoother-running automobile that represented a genuine leap forward in automotive technology. But Henry had a problem. He desperately wanted to quit his job and become a full-time inventor, but he didn't have nearly enough money to support himself and his family. He needed investors, which meant he needed to convince wealthy men that his automobiles were worth their money. Henry set out to find backers for what would become his first business venture. In 1899, Henry got his chance when he drove a wealthy lumber salesman on a 3.5-mile demonstration ride. By the end of the trip, the salesman was so impressed that he immediately agreed to invest in Henry's company. Word spread quickly among Detroit's wealthy elite, and Henry managed to secure 12 investors and $15,000 in capital. The Detroit Automobile Company was born in August 1899, with Henry as chief engineer. But success turned into nightmare almost immediately. While Henry wanted to create efficient, well-made vehicles that ordinary people could afford, his investors had very different ideas. They demanded a variety of different vehicles built as quickly as possible to sell at premium prices to wealthy hobbyists. They didn't care about quality or reliability. They wanted profits, and they wanted them fast. Henry found himself in constant conflict with his shareholders. They grew furious with production delays while Henry insisted on perfection. He had mastered how to build individual automobiles with care and precision, but his investors were pushing him to mass-produce vehicles at a quality level he wasn't comfortable with, at prices he felt were unjustified. The public agreed with Henry. The vehicles were simply too expensive for their poor quality. The company struggled with profitability, delays, and constant internal conflicts. Within just 2 years of its grand opening, the Detroit Automobile Company was dissolved in 1901. Henry's first attempt at commercial success had ended in complete failure. Despite the collapse of his company, Henry still had well-connected friends in Detroit who allowed him to continue working on his inventions in their warehouses. Although his first business venture hadn't worked out, Henry now had more freedom to focus on what he actually wanted to do, and what he wanted was to build race cars. Racing appealed to Henry because it allowed him to focus on perfecting a single automobile rather than mass-producing mediocre vehicles. He had developed a theory that other racers were too focused on raw power when the real secret was making cars lighter. Henry began work on a lightweight 26-horsepower, two-cylinder racer that embodied this philosophy. His theory proved correct. Henry's lightweight racer won his first competition, a 10-lap race at the Detroit Driving Club. Following the fame he gained from winning several more races, many of the same shareholders from his failed Detroit Automobile Company contacted Henry again. They figured that given his recent success in racing, maybe they should try to create another company together. This led to the founding of the Henry Ford Company, which aimed to produce lightweight city cars for everyday use. But Henry's racing victories had made him obsessed with speed and performance. All he wanted to do was build faster and faster race cars, constantly chasing mechanical perfection rather than focusing on profitable passenger vehicles. Once again, Henry found himself in constant conflict with his investors. They wanted him to produce marketable cars and generate profits, while Henry fixated on the mechanical capabilities of individual race cars. The frustrated investors eventually replaced Henry Ford as chief engineer of the Henry Ford Company. Henry left his own company, signing a contract that gave him back the rights to his name, $900 in cash, and the designs for a 4-cylinder racer he had been developing. After his departure, the investors reorganized the business as the Cadillac Automobile Company, which went on to achieve great commercial success without him. Now Henry Ford was on his own again, with 2 business failures under his belt, but he wasn't about to give up. He returned to racing and in 1901 created the groundbreaking Ford 999, a car that dominated the competition. 2 years later, an improved version of this car broke all American driving records with a top speed of 56 miles per hour. This success in racing catapulted Henry Ford's reputation to new heights, once again attracting investors who wanted to work with him. Surely there had to be some way to turn Henry's mechanical genius into a profitable company. This led to Henry starting his third and final business venture in 1903, the Ford Motor Company. Chapter 5. The Slaughterhouse Epiphany. In a Chicago slaughterhouse watching cows on conveyor belts, Henry Ford saw the future of human labor. While cars remained luxury items for the wealthy, Henry had always dreamed of changing that fundamental reality. He made a bold declaration: "I will build a motor car for the great multitude." His new company's first product was the Model A, a 2-cylinder, 8-horsepower passenger car that sold for $750, just a week before Henry's 40th birthday. It was a reasonable start, but production was painfully slow. At their factory on Mack Avenue in Detroit, several workers built only 2 or 3 cars each day, crafting each vehicle entirely by hand from start to finish. This artisanal approach produced quality automobiles, but it would never achieve Henry's goal of making cars affordable for ordinary people. Everything changed during a visit to a Chicago slaughterhouse. Henry watched in fascination as cow carcasses moved along an automatic conveyor belt, while each worker performed one specific task to prepare the meat for consumption. The workers moved like perfectly synchronized components in a machine, achieving incredible speed and efficiency through specialization and repetition. Henry had his eureka moment. He decided to adopt this assembly line concept for his car factories, splitting the entire production process into a series of small individual tasks. He would assign each worker to perform just one specific job, which they could complete quickly and repeatedly without requiring extensive skill or experience. The results were revolutionary. Factory efficiency increased by 500% almost immediately. Henry was able to expand rapidly, hiring 300 new employees because he could now employ cheap, unskilled labor to perform these repetitive assembly line tasks. Workers didn't need years of training or deep mechanical knowledge. They just needed to master one simple job. Henry pushed his innovation even further. Having experienced firsthand how a single missing part could delay car production for weeks, he began manufacturing all individual car components in his own factories. Instead of depending on outside suppliers for engines, transmissions, and other parts, Ford would make everything themselves. This vertical integration sped up production time even more dramatically. The transformation was staggering. Where it had initially taken Henry 2.5 days to build a single car, the new assembly line process reduced that time to just 90 minutes. This extreme improvement in efficiency set the stage for Henry to launch the vehicle that would make him a legend, the Model T. Thanks to all the production improvements Henry had implemented, he was finally able to produce a car designed for the average person rather than wealthy hobbyists. The Model T embodied 3 core principles. It had to be affordable, durable, and easy to operate. Every Model T rolled out of the factory with identical, interchangeable parts and the same shade of black paint. Each car came with a detailed instruction manual so owners could understand and repair their vehicles themselves. The Model T became an immediate bestseller, generating huge profits for the company and allowing them to scale up production even further. By 1914, Henry Ford was selling more cars than all other automobile manufacturers in America combined. Before long, every other car on the road seemed to be a Ford. Most surprisingly, as Model T sales exploded, Henry steadily decreased the price of his car. While this strategy seemed counterintuitive to most business people, Henry understood that lower prices would attract even more customers and ensure the Model T remained the most popular choice. By the end of its production run, over 15 million Model T automobiles would be sold. But Henry's revolutionary assembly line system created an unexpected problem. Many of his workers had become extremely dissatisfied with their jobs. They had gone from assembling entire cars by hand, using their skills and craftsmanship, to performing the same monotonous task over and over again, day after day. All the pride and creativity seemed to have been stripped away by the relentless efficiency of the assembly line. Workers began quitting in droves. The Ford Motor Company faced an astronomical turnover rate of 380%, meaning they had to replace nearly 4 times their entire workforce every single year. This level of employee dissatisfaction threatened to destroy the company Henry had worked so hard to build. Chapter 6. The Weekend Revolution. The man who would later employ slave labor first gave workers their weekends. Faced with mass resignations and plummeting morale, Henry Ford made a decision that shocked the business world. He doubled his workers' pay from $2.50 to $5 per day. In 1914, this was considered an exceptionally generous wage, much higher than what other companies were paying their employees. But Henry didn't stop there. Recognizing that many of his workers were immigrants who struggled with communication on the factory floor, he provided free English lessons to help them integrate better into the workforce. He also reduced working hours from 9 to 8 hours per day and introduced the revolutionary concept of the 5-day workweek, giving his employees weekends off. Up until this point, most workers only got Sundays off, if they were lucky. These changes went completely against the business norms of the time, and Henry's shareholders were absolutely outraged. They felt like money was being stolen directly from their pockets and handed to workers for no good reason. How could Henry justify doubling wages and reducing working hours when the company was already profitable? Henry tried to explain his theory to the furious shareholders. He believed that allowing workers to have more rest and better pay would inspire them to work harder when they were on the job. The higher wages would also attract better workers and reduce the costly turnover problem that was threatening the company's stability. Henry's gamble paid off spectacularly. Workers from across the country began flocking to Ford factories in Detroit, creating an economic boom for the city and forcing competitors to implement similar policies because they were losing their best employees to Ford. Henry's decision to reduce the workday by 1 hour also allowed him to add a third 8-hour shift to the daily schedule. With 3 8-hour shifts, Ford factories could operate 24 hours a day, staying productive around the clock. While Henry's innovations seemed radical at the time, they all made perfect business sense. It's largely thanks to Henry Ford that most modern businesses today operate on the 8-hour workday and 5-day workweek model. But the shareholders couldn't see past their immediate concerns about reduced profits. The conflict escalated when shareholders ordered Henry to stop increasing wages. When he refused, they took him to court, claiming that he was intentionally costing them money and breaching his fiduciary duties as a corporate officer. Henry felt like his life's work was being stolen from him. He had built this company from nothing, and just when he was finally seeing unprecedented success, shareholder conflicts were putting everything at risk once again. Henry knew he couldn't afford to start over a fourth time. He needed to seize complete control of the Ford Motor Company as quickly as possible. In 1906, using his personal savings and taking enormous financial risk, Henry bought enough company stock to bring his ownership interest up to 51%. This made him the majority owner and controlling shareholder, but it also meant he had put essentially all of his money into the company. He was betting everything on his own vision and abilities. Chapter 7. The Iron Fist. Behind the innovation's success didn't soften Henry Ford, it revealed who he really was. In 1919, Henry made a decision that seemed generous on the surface. He handed over the presidency of Ford Motor Company to his son Edsel, officially making the younger man the leader of the automotive empire. But this transfer of power was largely ceremonial. Henry continued to rule the company behind the scenes with an iron fist, making all the important decisions while undermining his son at every turn. Edsel Ford was everything his father wasn't: thoughtful, collaborative, and forward-thinking. He came to work each day with new plans and proposals for modernizing the company, understanding that the automotive industry was evolving rapidly and Ford needed to evolve with it. But Henry was extraordinarily harsh toward his son, responding to Edsel's ideas with barrages of shouting and public humiliation. Henry refused to approve any new car models that Edsel suggested, insisting that the Model T was all customers wanted or needed. When Edsel persisted with his modernization efforts, Henry ordered members of upper management to send his son on pointless week-long business trips across the country, effectively exiling him from important company decisions. The message was clear: despite his title, Edsel had no real power in the company that bore the family name. It turned out that Edsel's instincts about modernization were absolutely correct. Year after year, Model T sales declined as American consumers grew more prosperous and sophisticated. The economic boom of the 1920s and the availability of cheap credit created public demand for more stylized, luxurious automobiles. Competitors like General Motors and Chrysler were happy to provide these modern vehicles, while Ford stubbornly stuck with the increasingly outdated Model T. Finally, in 1927, Henry could no longer ignore the dramatically diminishing sales figures. He reluctantly consented to developing a new vehicle to replace the Model T. The new Model A was designed to meet modern consumer demands, featuring the first commercial V8 engine and offered in 4 different colors instead of just black. But Henry's stubborn resistance to change had cost the company dearly. By the time Ford could begin selling their modern Model A, they had already fallen to third place among American car manufacturers, behind both Chrysler and General Motors. The company that had once dominated the industry was now playing catch-up because of Henry's inflexibility and ego. The situation got worse when the Great Depression hit America in 1929. Ford was forced to lay off thousands of workers and reduce the high wages that had once made the company famous for treating employees well. While Henry still publicly claimed to be a champion of working people, his actions told a very different story. When Henry heard that some of his remaining employees were attempting to form labor unions, he hired a secret police force to spy on workers and identify union organizers. These company enforcers didn't just observe, they actively intimidated and physically attacked workers who showed interest in collective bargaining. Henry had gone from being a pioneer of worker rights to being their oppressor. When workers organized protests against these harsh tactics, Henry ordered security forces to break up the demonstrations with tear gas and even gunfire. The violence reached its peak during what became known as the Ford Massacre, when 4 workers were killed and dozens more were injured during a peaceful protest at the River Rouge plant. The man who had once given workers weekends and higher wages was now literally shooting them for demanding fair treatment. Chapter 8. Fordlandia. Paradise Lost. Henry Ford tried to build a utopia in the Amazon and created hell on earth instead. In the late 1920s, Henry embarked on perhaps his strangest venture yet. He purchased millions of acres of land in the Brazilian rainforest, in one of the most remote and challenging places on the planet. His stated goal was practical. Synthetic rubber didn't exist yet, but Ford's mass production of automobiles required vast quantities of rubber for tires and other components. Henry's plan was to establish a rubber plantation deep in the Amazon jungle where workers could harvest rubber from thousands of trees and ship the raw materials back to Detroit. The rubber would then be processed into tires and other parts for Ford vehicles, giving the company complete control over this crucial supply chain. But rubber production was only part of Henry's vision. He also wanted to create what he called a perfect society, a utopian town modeled after the rural America of his childhood. He envisioned a self-sufficient community in the heart of the jungle, where all the plantation workers would live according to his personal values and moral standards. He called this ambitious project Fordlandia, and it was unlike anything that had ever been attempted. The town included residential homes, shops, schools, a hospital, a golf course, and a massive processing plant for rubber production. At its peak, Fordlandia housed over 7,000 people in the middle of the Amazon rainforest. But Henry insisted that his jungle town operate under a strict and increasingly controversial set of rules, all enforced by American managers who understood little about Brazilian culture or tropical conditions. Alcohol, tobacco, and even playing sports were completely banned throughout the community, including in residents' private homes. Henry established a police force to ensure these rules were rigidly enforced, regardless of local customs or preferences. Fordlandia quickly began facing enormous challenges that Henry had never anticipated. The Amazon's extreme weather patterns, devastating disease outbreaks, growing anger among Brazilian workers, and constant environmental disasters all signaled that this utopian experiment was heading toward catastrophic failure. Despite mounting evidence of serious problems, Henry continued pouring millions of dollars into Fordlandia, refusing to acknowledge that his vision might be flawed. His determination to impose American Midwest values on Amazon jungle workers created constant conflict and resentment. The Brazilian employees felt like prisoners in their own country, subjected to foreign rules that made no sense in their environment. The end came when a devastating plant disease swept through Fordlandia's rubber trees, crippling production just as worker discontent exploded into open revolt. Brazilian employees, fed up with the oppressive rules and cultural insensitivity, staged violent protests that made continued operations impossible. Henry finally had to accept that Fordlandia was an expensive and humiliating failure. He sold the entire plantation to the Brazilian government for only $250,000, a tiny fraction of the millions he had invested in the project. The deserted ruins of Fordlandia still remain in the Amazon today, a monument to Henry Ford's hubris and his complete inability to understand cultures different from his own. Chapter 9. Hitler's American Hero. While Americans bought Ford cars, Nazis bought Ford's ideas. As Henry Ford grew older and more powerful, he developed an increasingly dangerous obsession with Jewish people, blaming them for virtually everything he disliked about modern society. A close friend later quoted Henry saying, "The Jew caused the war. The Jew caused the outbreak of thievery and robbery in the country. The Jew even caused insufficiencies in the Navy." Henry's anti-Semitism wasn't just a private prejudice, it became a public crusade. He purchased and funded a newspaper specifically to publish anti-Semitic articles and spread his hatred to as many people as possible. The paper featured a weekly section called The International Jew, the World's Problem, which promoted conspiracy theories and stereotypes that portrayed Jewish people as a global threat. Through aggressive sales and distribution strategies, Henry's anti-Semitic newspaper reached 700,000 weekly readers at its peak, making it one of the most widely read publications promoting hatred in American history. Henry published over 60 articles attacking Jewish people, later compiling them into 4 books that spread his toxic ideology even further. These publications caught the attention of Adolf Hitler and the emerging Nazi Party in Germany. Hitler himself declared that Henry Ford was a great personal inspiration to him, and he reportedly kept a life-sized portrait of Henry Ford hanging in his office. Hitler distributed Henry Ford's anti-Semitic books and articles throughout Germany, using them as propaganda tools to justify Nazi ideology. Henry Ford was even mentioned by name in Hitler's autobiography, Mein Kampf, where the future dictator praised the American industrialist as a fellow believer in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The connection between Henry Ford and Nazi ideology was not coincidental or accidental. It was deliberate and mutual. In 1938, the Nazi Party awarded Henry Ford the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest medal that Nazi Germany could bestow on foreigners. This honor was given specifically for Henry's ideals and devotion to the same cause as the Nazi Party. Rather than refusing this recognition from a regime that was already showing its true nature, Henry Ford gladly accepted the award. Henry Ford's relationship with Nazism went far beyond symbolic gestures and shared ideology. A U.S. Army report from 1945 stated that the German branch of Ford Motor Company, still under Henry Ford's control, served as an arsenal of Nazism during World War II. While most American companies withdrew their operations from Germany when the war began, Ford continued using German plants to produce vehicles and equipment for the Nazi war machine. American soldiers fighting in Europe reported the disturbing experience of seeing their enemies, the Germans, driving Ford automobiles into battle against them. Even more shocking, multiple reports indicated that Ford's German operations utilized slave labor from Nazi concentration camps to produce cars and trucks for the German military. What becomes clear from examining this evidence is that Henry Ford was not merely anti-Semitic in his personal beliefs. He was incredibly influential in spreading anti-Semitism around the world, providing intellectual ammunition for the Holocaust and material support for the regime that carried it out. Chapter 10. Legacy and Reckoning. He gave us weekends and mass production, but what did he take in return? In 1943, Henry's son Edsel died from stomach cancer at the age of 49, having never seen his vision for modernizing Ford Motor Company fully realized. Throughout Edsel's entire adult life, Henry had dominated and publicly humiliated his son, refusing to let him implement the innovations that could have kept Ford competitive. Henry Ford's own grandson later claimed that Henry had essentially berated Edsel to death, arguing that the constant stress and psychological abuse from his father had made Edsel physically ill and contributed to his early death. The man who had revolutionized industrial production had destroyed his own family through his inability to share power or show basic human compassion. Within 4 years of Edsel's death, Henry Ford himself died in 1947 at the age of 83. The Ford Motor Company was left without clear leadership succession, creating chaos in the corporate structure that Henry had ruled with absolute authority for nearly 4 decades. The leadership crisis that followed Henry's death revealed just how dependent the company had become on his personal control. While Henry Ford had single-handedly led the company for 39 years, Ford Motor Company would change CEOs 13 times over the next 41 years. The organizational instability showed that Henry's authoritarian management style, while effective for innovation, had failed to develop sustainable institutional leadership. Despite the management turmoil, Ford Motor Company continued finding commercial success by building on the foundations Henry had established. The company produced best-selling vehicles like the Thunderbird, Mustang, and countless other classics that became icons of American automotive culture. However, Ford would never again dominate the industry as completely as it had under its original founder. Henry Ford's legacy remained deeply controversial within his own company and American society. On one hand, he was undeniably a genius and innovator who had pioneered assembly line production, created the modern concept of mass manufacturing, and improved working conditions for millions of people. On the other hand, he had been brutal toward labor unions, violently opposed worker organizing, and had actively spread racist and anti-Semitic ideology around the world. In 2001, Ford Motor Company was forced to confront the darkest aspects of its founder's legacy. The company agreed to a $5 billion settlement providing reparations for using Jewish slave labor in Nazi concentration camps to build factory materials during World War II. This massive financial settlement represented a formal acknowledgement of Henry Ford's complicity in some of the worst crimes in human history. In recent decades, Ford Motor Company has attempted to distance itself from its founder's ideology while building on his industrial innovations. The company has focused heavily on developing fuel-efficient vehicles and electric hybrids, trying to lead the automotive industry's transition away from fossil fuels. In July 2023, the U.S. Department of Energy announced that it would provide Ford with a $9.2 billion loan to manufacture completely electric vehicles, the largest loan in the history of the automotive industry. This massive government investment represents faith in Ford's ability to innovate and adapt, just as Henry Ford had done more than a century earlier. Today, Ford Motor Company is valued at over $50 billion and ranks as one of the 10 largest car companies in the world. It's easy to forget that this massive corporation started with a single farm boy and his obsessive desire to create a new kind of machine. Henry Ford remains one of the most complex and controversial figures in American business history. He fundamentally changed how we work, how we manufacture products, and how we think about the relationship between employers and employees. He gave workers weekends, 8-hour workdays, and higher wages than they had ever imagined possible. But he also showed how innovation and progress can coexist with hatred and oppression. He proved that someone can revolutionize industry while simultaneously supporting some of the most evil ideologies in human history. Henry Ford's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The people who change the world aren't always good people, and progress often comes with a price we're not prepared to pay. So the next time you enjoy a weekend, remember, it came from a man who believed some humans weren't human at all. Henry Ford didn't just change how we work, he changed how we think about who deserves to be free. The question that remains is, was the trade worth it? If this story shocked you, prove it. Hit like, drop your raw thoughts in the comments, and subscribe so you never miss the truths history tried to hide.